Ever wonder what it feels like to be unwashed, mildly cursed, and surrounded by the smell of boiled onions and death? Welcome to Hygiene during the Black Plague. Tonight, we're not talking about kings or crusades. We're peeling back the damp layers of history to find out what it actually meant to be clean in a world where baths were suspicious, rats were plentiful, and your best medical advice came from someone who thought demons lived in your spleen. This isn't history in armour. It's history in dirt under your fingernails and a bucket under the bed. So if this kind of slow, quiet unravelling helps you drift off, go ahead and like the video and subscribe. But only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments what time it is where you are and where you're listening from. There's something oddly comforting about knowing you're not the only one falling asleep to the sound of forgotten suffering. Now dim the lights. Turn on a fan if you like that soft, endless hum. And let's begin. What did it mean to be clean in the 1300s? The short answer, less than you think. The long answer, it depended on who you were, where you lived, and how recently you'd stepped in something unfortunate. To be clean wasn't about being sanitized. It was about being presentable enough not to be accused of harboring a demon in your armpit. There was no word for germ yet. No hygiene routine. No shelf in the bathroom lined with self-worth and scented lotion. Mostly, being clean meant not being offensively filthy. You could smell a bit. You could look like you'd lost a fight with a sack of potatoes. But if no one flinched when you sat beside them at Mass, you were probably fine. Baths existed, but not in the daily, calming, candle-lit, eucalyptus-scented sense. They were events, not habits. For most peasants, bathing happened when it rained particularly hard and you accidentally fell into a pond. There were bathhouses in cities, communal ones, where people would undress, sweat, rinse, and sometimes get a haircut or catch a disease, depending on who else had been there that day. But in villages, baths were buckets. The water was cold. The firewood was scarce. And modesty was a luxury no one could really afford. Showers didn't exist. That was still centuries away. The closest you came to something falling on your head was rain or a collapsing roof beam. You didn't step under anything to rinse. You squatted near a basin, splashed strategically, and hoped no one walked in. It wasn't refreshing. It was survival. Soap, when available, was rough. Sometimes made with animal fat and ash, it felt like trying to exfoliate with sand and regret. It didn't smell nice. It didn't lather. It was closer to a moral decision than a cleansing one. Something you used when the situation had gone beyond what a cloth and a prayer could handle. Most people didn't own soap. Most people didn't even miss it. Clothing carried its own version of cleanliness. You didn't change outfits often. You didn't have outfits. You had a set of clothes, maybe two, that cycled between being worn and being vaguely damp. Linen underclothes helped absorb sweat, and if you had them, you washed those more often. Not because it was expected, but because the smell could actually make you lightheaded by week 2. Outer garments were rarely cleaned. They were aired, shaken, beaten with sticks if things got serious. Laundry wasn't routine. It was an emergency. Tooth care was, at best, aspirational. Some people chewed mint or rubbed their teeth with cloth. Others rinsed with wine or vinegar, but no one was whitening anything. Teeth weren't supposed to sparkle. They were supposed to stay in your mouth as long as possible. That was the whole goal. And if they didn't, well, porridge didn't require much chewing anyway. Hair was another matter entirely. Clean hair was relative. Oily, yes. Tangled, probably. Alive sometimes. Lice were common companions. So were fleas. Combs were used not to style, but to evict. The goal wasn't to shine. It was to manage. A braid kept things contained. A scarf hid the worst of it. No one expected to look like a painting. You were just trying not to accidentally carry a nest. The idea of a personal scent was different too. Everyone smelled like something. Usually smoke, wool, dirt, and anxiety. Livestock added notes of manure. Wet weather added mildew. There wasn't deodorant. There wasn't perfume, unless you were nobility or recently robbed one. The natural scent of a medieval peasant was earthy, sour, and entirely authentic. Sanitation in the public sense didn't exist. Waste went in pits, in ditches, or wherever seemed least likely to be stepped in before supper. Cities had gutters, sort of, but in villages, nature was the infrastructure. The bushes, the back fence, the area behind the shed where nothing grew. Those were your options. Chamber pots existed, especially indoors, and were emptied with varying degrees of optimism. But the truth is, waste disposal was more an art of forgetfulness than engineering. You buried it, covered it, or ignored it. And yet, in the quiet corners of this muddied world, there were systems, there were rituals. People did try. They washed their hands before meals. They combed their hair for Sunday Mass. They cleaned wounds with wine or vinegar, or boiled herbs and said prayers as they did. They swept the hearth. They beat dust from mats. They boiled bandages. They whispered instructions to their children. Don't drink from the stagnant pond. Don't step where the pigs sleep. Don't eat anything you didn't see cooked. These weren't hygiene rules. They were survival instincts, passed down in stories, reinforced by memory, and practiced without knowing why they worked. Even religious cleanliness played a role. Baptisms, ritual washings, sacred wells, clean water was tied to spiritual renewal. You might not wash for fashion, but you might wash for God. Pilgrims sometimes walked for days to bathe in holy springs. Monks tended gardens of medicinal herbs and taught that purity wasn't just about the soul. There was a quiet connection between the body and the divine, even if no one could explain it in medical terms. But the average peasant didn't live in a world of sterility. Dirt was part of life. It lived under your nails and in the creases of your skin. It collected in your clothes, in your bedding, in the folds of the straw mattress you shared with 3 siblings and a goat. By winter, it was part of you. And when spring came, you peeled it off in layers, like the thawing of the earth itself. To be clean was not to be spotless. It was to be functional. It was to smell less than your neighbour. It was to scrub your hands when the stew looked too grey, and to rinse your feet when the priest gave you that particular look. It was about managing the grime, not erasing it. So when the Black Death came, when the fleas carried fever, and the coughing turned wet, and the air itself began to feel like a warning, it wasn't that people were dirty because they were ignorant. They were dirty because they were alive, because the world was made of mud and ash and smoke, because soap was rare, and time was short, and firewood was precious and bodies were fragile. They weren't unhygienic because they didn't care. They were unhygienic because the idea of a bacteria-free life had never even existed. Clean was a matter of degrees, and surviving was cleaner than dying. Everything else was just noise in the background, like the rustling of straw, the low groan of the wind, and the soft, familiar scent of someone who'd made it through another day. So no, they didn't have lavender soap. They didn't have hand sanitizer or toothpaste or shampoo. But they had water when it flowed. They had cloth when it dried. They had vinegar and boiling pots and prayers, and enough caution to walk wide around the puddles where pigs liked to lie. And maybe, in the quietest moments, when the fire was low and the children were asleep, and the world outside the shutters had gone still, they looked at their hands, at the dirt, at the calluses, and thought, this is clean enough. Because in the 1300s, cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was next to the fire. And if your skin was warm and your hair wasn't moving on its own, you were already ahead of the curve. When you think of medieval bathing, you might picture a knight easing into a wooden tub in a sun-drenched room, steam rising in graceful curls, a servant standing nearby with a pitcher of rose water. This is incorrect. The actual experience was closer to sitting in a lukewarm puddle with strangers, hoping no one brought lice, while someone in the corner tried to sell you boiled onions. Bathing happened. Just not the way we wish it had, and certainly not often. For most peasants, a bath wasn't scheduled. It was a seasonal event, or an accident. Maybe you slipped into a river. Maybe your spouse had finally had enough of the smell. Maybe someone died and you wanted to appear respectable for the funeral. There were reasons to bathe, but never a routine. The tub, when it existed, was made of wood. Half barrel, half hope. It sloshed when you moved. It leaked when you sat too long. It had no drain. You filled it with buckets, one by one. Water boiled over the fire, carried carefully to the tub, dumped in with a grunt, then cooled before you could get in. If you were the first to bathe, congratulations, you got the least amount of sediment. If you were last, the water was a soup of every bad decision that week. And it was communal, not always by choice. In wealthier homes, families shared bathwater because fuel was expensive and heating water took hours. A good soak meant several people took turns, in descending order of importance or cleanliness. Sometimes both. Parents first, then children, then the child who always had a mysterious rash. You didn't complain. You just got in and hoped the heat killed whatever was still floating. In cities and towns, there were bathhouses, public ones, steam-filled rooms tucked beside bakeries or near market squares. They were for men and women, though not usually at the same time. Some had separate hours. Some had curtains. Most had ambition. The water was heated in great tubs or cauldrons. The air was thick with smoke, sweat, and the scent of herbs. If the owner was feeling generous, they weren't luxurious. They were functional, and occasionally they were questionable. Because bathhouses were not just for bathing, they were also for gossip, medicine, haircuts, minor surgery, meals, naps, business transactions, religious conversations, and, frequently, sex. A bathhouse was part spa, part clinic, part social club, part very confused hotel. You might come to wash. You might leave with a new job, fewer teeth, or a second round of plague. It was unpredictable, like a medieval version of networking, if networking involved more nudity and slightly less eye contact. Monks and clergy had their own bathing habits. Monasteries were clean by comparison, but cleanliness wasn't the goal. Purity was. Baths were allowed, but often restricted. Some monks bathed only a few times a year, others more frequently, especially if illness was suspected. It was considered virtuous to stink a little, a reminder that the body was temporary and inconvenient. Smelling like sanctity meant smelling like mildew and boiled root vegetables. Soap, as we understand it, didn't really exist. There were substances, lye mixed with animal fat, clay with ash, bits of crushed herbs or burned bones. Some worked, most didn't. The result was a gritty paste that left you cleaner in the sense that it removed the top layer of skin. It smelled like smoke, it stung open cuts, and it didn't foam. But it scraped the worst of the grime off, and that was often enough. And yet, for all this, people did care about cleanliness, just not daily cleanliness. There was a sense of decency, of ritual, of preparing for holy days, weddings and guests. You washed your hands before meals, your feet before bed, and your soul before dying. These were gestures, not routines, enough to appear presentable without wasting firewood or ambition. In winter, bathing was even less frequent. The cold made water an enemy. A bath could kill you if the chill settled into your bones. Hair froze, fingers numbed, the fire barely kept up. Most people made do with sponge baths. Cloth dipped in warm water, applied quickly, modestly, and with as little exposure as possible. No one wanted to die because they tried to wash behind their ears. Hair washing was similarly rare. Long hair was braided, tied, or wrapped. Short hair was cropped or covered. Washing it meant hours of drying, risk of lice, and a certain amount of public commitment. You might go weeks, or longer, between rinses. You masked the smell with herbs, or didn't. It depended on how optimistic you were that day. And then there was the river. Rivers were both lifelines and landfills. They gave water. They took waste. They ran through towns and carried everything with them. Fish, silt, runoff, prayers. People bathed in them, washed clothes in them, dumped refuse in them, and occasionally pulled a body out. It was practical, if not ideal. And if you were downstream, you learned to boil first and ask questions later. Women especially bore the burden of household hygiene. They managed the water. They boiled the linens. They scrubbed what could be scrubbed and beat the rest against rocks until it stopped smelling like goats. Their hands were always dry, cracked, raw. Their sleeves were damp. They had no soap, no gloves, no miracle products, just time, habit, and a stubborn refusal to let the stew pot smell worse than it had to. Children were washed when necessary, sometimes before major church events, sometimes after a particularly ambitious mud puddle. Infants were wiped down regularly, but baths were rare. Water was hard to come by. Babies were resilient. You cleaned what you could, when you could, and you prayed the rash would clear on its own. Even nobles, with access to better resources, bathed less than you'd think. Their tubs were larger, their rooms warmer, their servants better trained at pretending not to notice. But bathing too often was still considered suspicious. It opened the pores, made you vulnerable. You could get sick from too much cleanliness. There were letters written about this, whole treatises, cautionary tales of people who washed too often and died confused and damp. And still, despite the risk, the effort, the communal awkwardness, people liked to bathe, when they could, when the weather allowed, when the fire was strong and the mood was right. A hot soak was a moment of luxury in a world full of work. It softened aches. It made you feel briefly human again. You didn't get to keep the feeling, but for half an hour maybe, you felt more like a person and less like a walking bag of chores. So no, bathing wasn't glamorous. It wasn't frequent. It wasn't scented with lavender or followed by a post about your favourite medieval skincare routine. But it mattered, in the same way sweeping mattered, or resting, or closing your eyes after a long day. It wasn't about cleanliness for its own sake. It was about survival, comfort, and the tiny acts of care that made life just barely bearable. And if the bathhouse was full, and the weather was cold, and the stew needed stirring, you skipped it. You told yourself you'd bathe next week, when the moon was right, when the fire burned longer, when the lice started arguing over territory. Because even in a world without soap, without shampoo, without certainty, there was still the idea of clean, not the clean we know, but a kind of honest, lived-in clean, one that didn't sparkle, didn't shine, but held warmth in its steam, and a kind of peace in the water that wasn't yet cold. Water in the medieval world was like a cousin you saw too often, essential, unpredictable, occasionally poisoned. You needed it to live, but trusting it too much could leave you doubled over in a field, praying for both forgiveness and a functioning stomach. It quenched your thirst. It also carried disease, drowned livestock, and once washed away your neighbour's chicken coop with the kind of casual cruelty only nature can afford. Clean water existed, just not in the way you wanted it to. Rivers ran through towns like veins through a body, pulsing with life, runoff, animal waste, dishwater, and whatever the butcher couldn't bury. They looked clear enough from a distance, especially at dawn when the mist hung low and romantic over the surface. But by midday, the illusion broke. You could smell it. You could see what floated past. And if you dipped a cup in without boiling it first, you were basically inviting the entire microbial population of Western Europe to set up camp in your gut. Wells were safer, until they weren't. A good well was a treasure, a deep one, cold and clear, lined with stone and protected with a wooden cover that creaked when you lifted it. It gave life to the village. You filled your pots there, washed your hands, whispered gossip while waiting your turn. But wells could be fouled. A dead rat could change everything. A poisoned bucket. A particularly bad thunderstorm that carried mud and worse things deep into the groundwater. And there were always rumours. A well cursed by a witch. A well haunted by a child who fell in. A well that ran dry after a woman washed her feet in it during a thunder moon. Some of it was nonsense. Some of it wasn't. Rainwater was pure, technically. Collected in barrels, it was used for washing, rinsing, and occasionally drinking. But it tasted like roof tile and bird droppings. It was the kind of water you didn't think too hard about. You closed your eyes. You swallowed. You hoped it wouldn't retaliate. Streams were popular for washing clothes and feet, but you never trusted them completely. Not if you lived downstream from a tannery or a pig farm. You learned to recognize the signs. Froth meant run. A strange colour meant someone upstream was either making dye or making mistakes. And if the animals refused to drink, you walked away without asking questions. Boiling helped, but not everyone boiled water unless they had a reason. Firewood was limited. Pots were precious. In monasteries and manors, water was sometimes filtered, through cloth, through gravel, through wishful thinking. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. The rich had the luxury of extra steps. The poor had the luxury of forgetting. You drank what you had. You prayed over it. You lived anyway. Bathhouses used vast amounts of water, heated in cauldrons, poured into shared tubs, recycled more often than anyone likes to imagine. If you visited one late in the day, you were sitting in the ghosts of a dozen strangers. The water had done its job. It had removed the dirt. Unfortunately, it hadn't left the building. Flooding was a different problem entirely. Water didn't just arrive quietly. Sometimes it roared in like a bored god, drowning the fields, flattening fences, turning roads into streams and streams into hazards. You woke up one morning and found your front step was part of the riverbank. You tied your goats to the rafters and hoped they didn't learn to swim. Crops drowned. Soil was ruined. And when the water finally receded, it left behind a smell like wet bread and despair. Too little water, and you were in a drought. Too much, and you were in trouble. There was rarely a happy middle. It didn't fall when you needed it. It fell during haying, during harvest, during childbirth. The sky never listened. It poured when the roof leaked. It held back when the barley needed it most. You watched the sky like a gambler watched the dice, praying it didn't roll a 7 too many times in a row. Still, water had its sacred moments. Holy wells were destinations. Pilgrims walked for days to dip their hands, drink a mouthful, wash a wound. Saints had been seen there, allegedly. Miracles had occurred. A blind man saw. A lame woman danced. Or someone's rash cleared up overnight, which in a medieval village was practically divine intervention. People left tokens, ribbons tied to branches, coins tossed into the water, hair, nails, whispered hopes. You didn't question the magic. You just waited your turn. Children were baptized in it. Corpses were cleaned in it. Sins were symbolically washed away with it. Water wasn't just practical. It was spiritual. It was part of birth, death, and every ordinary mess in between. You feared it, relied on it, and occasionally cursed it, usually when your only dry shirt fell in the trough. You learned, over time, which water was trustworthy. You smelled it, tasted it, listened to it. You avoided the green pond behind the mill. You watched the cows, what they drank, what they refused. You remembered the year your cousin fell ill after drinking from the hollow behind the chapel. You told your children not to follow the same path. Water didn't come from pipes. It didn't hum through walls or pour at the twist of a wrist. It came from effort, from walking, from boiling, from risk. Every cup was a choice. Every bucket was a gamble. You didn't have the luxury of thinking about hydration trends or mineral content. You just hoped it wouldn't hurt you on the way down. And when the plague came, when the coughing started, when the fever spread, when people died too quickly to bury, water became a question with no answer. Was it clean? Was it cursed? Was it safe to drink? Or was the well the thing that doomed the village? People panicked. Some boiled. Some prayed. Some swore off drinking entirely and leaned hard into ale. At least ale was predictable. Warm, flat, and not full of parasites. Unless the brewer had been particularly inattentive. Even after the worst passed, the memory of bad water lingered. You looked at every bucket with new suspicion. You sniffed every stream. You taught your children to never trust a puddle, no matter how clear it seemed. And still, you needed it. You drank it. You washed with it. You gave it to the cow and the baby, and the stranger who arrived at dusk, with cracked lips and no explanation. Because water was life, sometimes shortened, sometimes blessed, but always necessary. It turned the mill. It fed the field. It softened the bread. And when it was good, truly good, cold and sweet and clean, you didn't waste it. You drank it slowly. You smiled after. You gave thanks. Because in a world that rarely gave you anything easy, clean water felt like a small miracle. And when it wasn't clean, when it boiled you back from the inside out, you just endured. You wiped your face. You clutched your stomach. You whispered a prayer to no saint in particular. And when you recovered, you avoided that stream. You warned your children. You told the story, like a folk tale, but with real names. Because in the end, water didn't love you. But it didn't hate you either. It simply moved. Through rivers, through wells, through bodies. It remembered everything. And if you were lucky, it remembered to be kind. Laundry in the medieval world wasn't a chore. It was a crisis. A last resort. Something you did only when the clothes began to develop a personality of their own, or when the neighbour's goat mistook your tunic for a salt lick, and you had to reassess your life choices. You didn't do laundry every week. You did it when the wind changed direction and blew your own smell back in your face. For most people, clothes were a permanent relationship. You didn't swap them out for the season. You wore what you had until the seams gave up, or the fabric surrendered to entropy. You had one good outfit, usually the one you were born in, worked in, married in, and were probably going to be buried in if the stew went badly. Washing it felt like a gamble. What if it didn't survive the rinse? Let's start with materials. Wool was everywhere, scratchy, warm, water-resistant in theory, and capable of absorbing smells the way some stones absorb curses. Linen was used for underclothes, if you were lucky. It was softer, lighter, and marginally easier to clean, but it stained easily and tore often. Cotton wasn't common. Silk was for people who lived in buildings with more than one floor and no goats indoors. These clothes weren't mass-produced. They were hand-stitched, hand-mended, handed down. A tunic might start on your older brother, pass to you, then be turned into rags, then into patches, and finally become the lining of a chicken coop. Every thread had a story. Most of them involved mud. Washing clothes was rarely done at home. It required water, space, time, and a kind of stubborn optimism most people couldn't afford. So you took your laundry to the river, or to the communal wash area, if your village had one. A flat rock, a stretch of shallow water, and a piece of soap the size of a remorseful thumbtack. Lye was the main cleaning agent. Made from ash and water, it was caustic enough to peel the memory off a shirt. It worked, sort of, but it also stripped fabric, burned skin, and made your hands look like you'd been wrestling hedgehogs. You soaked the clothes in hot water, mixed with lye. You stirred them with a stick. You didn't touch the water if you valued your fingerprints. Scrubbing was minimal. You might beat the clothes with a paddle, slap them against a stone, or let the current do the work. You didn't overdo it. Cloth was precious. Holes were hard to fix, and if your shirt dissolved in your hands halfway through the rinse, no one was giving you another one, so you got the worst of the filth out and pretended the rest was just colour. Drying was its own ordeal. There were no dryers, no laundry lines, just fences, hedges, tree branches, and hope. If it rained, which it often did, you brought everything back inside and hung it from rafters, chairs, or your own shoulders if necessary. Clothes dried slowly, sometimes stiff, sometimes frozen, and often with the faint smell of whatever had crawled across them while they sat unattended. Underclothes were, let's say, a loose category. The idea was good, a layer between your skin and the outside world. But the reality was patchy, literally. These garments were rarely white, never fresh, and always threatening to become tomorrow's cleaning rags. Some people wore them, some didn't. Some wore the same pair so long they became part of the personality. If they were washed, it was only because someone else had finally said something. Blankets and linens were harder still. A blanket could weigh as much as a grown child, and had roughly the same temperament when wet. Washing it required boiling water, strong arms, and several hours you didn't have. Most people didn't. They aired it, beat it, brushed it with stiff straw, and told themselves it was fine. The human nose could adapt to anything, given enough time and exposure. Sheets, if you had them, were washed more often. Mostly because they were thinner, also because you slept in them, sweated in them, gave birth in them, and sometimes died in them. You didn't want to be the person who stained 3 generations of bedding. Washing was done in secret, if possible. Modesty mattered, even when you were ankle-deep in other people's regrets. Children's clothes were smaller, but no less filthy. They rolled in dirt. They wiped their noses on sleeves. They collected stains like medals. You washed their clothes, not because they cared, but because eventually someone else would notice. Toddlers, famously immune to shame, were sometimes cleaned in streams, fully clothed. Once wet, the outfit counted as laundry. 2 birds, 1 very shivering child. Stains were part of life. You could identify someone's trade by the marks on their sleeves. Black smudges for smiths, green for tanners, red for butchers, yellow for bad luck. You didn't try to hide them. You leaned into it. You let the dirt settle until it felt less like a mess and more like history. And then there was the smell. Wet wool, sweat, smoke, salt. It clung. It lingered. It became part of you. You masked it with herbs. Lavender, if you had it. Rosemary. Mint. But mostly you just stopped noticing. If you didn't stink more than the neighbour, you were clean enough. Women did most of the washing. Their hands were always moving. Stirring pots, darning socks, slapping shirts against stone. They taught daughters how to check for fleas in a seam, how to dry a tunic without creasing the shoulder, how to rinse a cloth with vinegar to kill the worst of the smell. They didn't write books. They didn't get statues. But they knew how to keep a family from disappearing into its own laundry pile. In towns, professional washerwomen existed. They charged a fee, took your clothing, returned it days later with fewer stains and more holes. Their hands were cracked. Their backs were bent. They were both respected and suspected, because anyone who handled that much linen probably knew too much. Even the nobility, with their silks and servants, couldn't escape the laundry problem. Their clothes were embroidered, layered, decorated with things that had no business being near mud. They wore perfume to cover the smell, powder to dry the skin, linen shifts to absorb the sweat, then handed the mess to someone else. Nobility didn't mean you smelled better. It just meant you didn't have to smell yourself. And still, laundry was a kind of ritual. It wasn't just about being clean. It was about control. In a world of plagues, bad harvests, broken roofs, and unpredictable lords, washing a tunic felt like winning a small battle. You couldn't stop the rain, but you could scrub mud from a hem. You couldn't prevent a fever, but you could hang sheets in the sun and pretend they smelled like something holy. You didn't wash clothes to impress anyone. You washed them because they needed it, because your mother had, because the cloth wouldn't last otherwise, because somewhere, deep beneath the dirt and the wear and the smell, the fabric remembered what it was like to be new. And maybe, as you hung a shirt across the back fence, shaking the water from its sleeves, you remembered too. In the medieval world, the phrase basic hygiene was more theory than practice. You didn't have a bathroom. You had a bowl. Maybe. Soap, if you had it, was a hardened lump of ash and animal fat stored in a place of reverence, usually a windowsill, or wrapped in a bit of cloth, like something sacred. The idea was simple: clean the parts that mattered. The definition of mattered was loose. Your hands got the most attention. They were the tools of everything: eating, working, praying, sewing, carrying, washing other things that should have been washed long ago. You cleaned them when you remembered, or when someone gave you a look at supper that said, "Please don't touch the bread with that." Washing meant dipping them in a bowl of water, maybe with herbs or vinegar, maybe just cold and cloudy from earlier use. If they were stained, ink, pitch, blood, you rubbed them with sand or flour. If that didn't work, you wore the stain like a badge. Soap helped, but not always. It stung. It was caustic. It smelled faintly like the cow that helped make it. You didn't expect your hands to feel soft. You expected them to feel less sticky. That was the goal. Calluses were normal. Cracks were expected. Your fingernails were a combination of storage unit and conversation starter. People could tell how your day had gone just by looking at them. Soil meant planting. Soot meant firewood. Dried blood meant you'd had a very long morning and a chicken with opinions. Your face was cleaned more often, especially if you lived with others. A cloth, a bit of water, a quick scrub. No mirrors. No soap unless something had gone dramatically wrong. You didn't expect to glow. You just hoped to remove whatever had dried on you overnight. Sometimes this included insects. Sometimes it was stew. You dealt with it quietly, with a damp corner of the sleeve, pretending it had never happened. Hair was another matter entirely. It was a constant negotiation between what you wanted it to do and what it was actively planning. Washing it was rare. It took time, water, and the kind of determination normally reserved for childbirth. So you worked around it, you braided it, you tied it, you covered it with a coif, hood, or scarf. For the poor, this kept it out of the fire and the food. For the wealthy, it kept it out of sight entirely, because showing your hair was borderline scandalous, depending on the decade. Combs were made of wood, bone, or horn. Carried in pouches. Used frequently, not for vanity, but for lice. Everyone had them. Children, adults, monks, midwives. Lice didn't care if you could read. They were democracy in insect form. So you combed. Regularly. You crushed what you found between your nails or beside the fire. You compared stories with others. Who had it worse? Who was winning? It was like war, but itchier. Men shaved occasionally, not daily. That would have been absurd. Razors were expensive and blunt. Most men had beards or stubble. It wasn't about fashion. It was about whether someone owned a sharp enough blade and had time to use it. A shave was reserved for feast days, weddings, or the rare visit to someone with steadier hands. You didn't ask for a trim unless you wanted to explain your new scar for the rest of the month. Tooth care, if you can call it that, was instinctive. You chewed mint. You rinsed with wine, if you could afford to. You rubbed your teeth with cloth, or scraped them with sticks. There were no toothbrushes, no dental floss, no mouthwash. There were toothpicks, made of wood or bone. And there was prayer. You hoped your molars held out long enough to chew barley for another winter. Toothaches were common. Extra teeth weren't. If you lost a tooth, you adjusted. If you had rot, you suffered. There were remedies: garlic pressed to the gum, cloves stuffed in the cheek, vinegar gargles, hot stones, cold compresses, and occasionally someone brave with pliers. The brave rarely had repeat customers. There were no fillings, no enamel-strengthening rituals. If your teeth fell out, they fell out. You moved on. Slowly. Chewing was optional. Porridge was not. Body odour was expected. Everyone had it. Everyone dealt with it differently. Herbs were tucked into clothing. Lavender, rosemary, mint, sage. Sometimes it helped. Sometimes it just made you smell like a garden that had given up. You didn't cover the smell. You softened it. You rearranged it. You made peace with it. Pits were wiped with cloth, occasionally rinsed, not shaved, not scented. If someone truly reeked, they were told. Gently, with a gift of soap and a nervous laugh. Most people learned to detect the difference between normal musk and this might be a problem. You sniffed, you sighed, you moved on. Feet were cleaned when they had to be, after long walks, before holy days, before bed, if your partner insisted. They were soaked in warm water, rubbed with oil or lard if cracked. Toenails were trimmed with knives or teeth, depending on desperation. You didn't pamper them, you just kept them from falling apart. Wounds were cleaned more carefully. A cut was an invitation. Dirt got in. Infection followed. So you rinsed with wine or vinegar. You applied honey, herbs or crushed onion. You wrapped it in linen and prayed it didn't fester. Hands were always at risk. Feet too. Any exposed skin, really. And you didn't always know when something was just sore or about to change your entire week. You watched. You waited. You hoped. Women managed monthly hygiene with a mixture of rags, moss, and discretion. It wasn't talked about. It wasn't ignored. It was simply handled. Quietly. Efficiently. If a woman looked tired, no one asked. If she wasn't at mass, no one said anything. The knowledge passed down silently, from mother to daughter, from midwife to apprentice. No one invented modern solutions, but no one bled alone either. Children learned by imitation. Watching their parents scrub, watching them rinse, watching them comb. A child knew which bucket was for washing and which was for waste. They knew how to clean a scrape. They knew how to avoid lice, mostly. They were taught the rhythms of cleanliness the same way they were taught to plant, to pray, to hold a spoon. And yet, despite all of this, people still tried. There was pride in being presentable. A clean face on a feast day. Neatly combed hair at a wedding. Hands rinsed before supper. You didn't have to look perfect. You had to look intentional. You didn't want to be remembered as the one who showed up filthy. You wanted to be remembered at all. So no, you didn't wake up to a morning routine involving 20 steps and 3 serums. You didn't track hydration or exfoliate or follow a sacred calendar of skincare. But you washed. You scraped. You plucked. You wiped what needed wiping. You did what you could with what you had. And in the end, that was enough. If your hands weren't sticky, your face wasn't crusted, and your teeth hadn't rebelled yet, you called it a good day. You smiled, if you still could. You rinsed your hands, if the water was warm. You looked at your reflection in a puddle, and if you could still see your own eyes through the murk, you counted yourself clean. Let's talk about waste. Human waste. The kind you don't bring up at the dinner table, unless you live in a village small enough that the dinner table is also where you store the bucket. In the medieval world, relieving yourself wasn't private, glamorous, or even especially efficient. It was just part of life. Loud, inconvenient, occasionally strategic, and ideally someone else's problem. Toilets, as we know them, did not exist. There was no porcelain, no flushing, no scented candles, no gentle blue disinfectant that promised ocean breeze and delivered only regret. There was instead a spectrum of possibility, ranging from reasonably functional hole to whatever is behind that bush. And where you landed on that spectrum said a lot about your social standing, your resourcefulness, and your willingness to wade into questionable spaces after dark. If you were lucky, your village had a latrine, a shared one, a simple structure built over a pit, maybe with a thatched roof and some kind of door if someone had extra wood and a vague sense of decency. You squatted over a board, did your business, and walked away. The pit filled slowly. It was covered with ash or straw. When it reached a critical mass of existential horror, someone, Usually someone with bad luck or fewer relatives was assigned to dig a new one. If you were less lucky, you had a chamber pot. A ceramic bowl kept under the bed, beside the fire, or near the door, depending on your optimism. It was used at night, during bad weather, or when you simply couldn't be bothered to make the journey outside. It was emptied in the morning, ideally, sometimes into the latrine, sometimes into the pigsty, sometimes, if you lived in a city, straight out the window, with a quick shout of "Gardiloo!" to warn pedestrians. Not everyone shouted. Not everyone cared. Some people didn't have a pot. They had a corner, a patch of ground, a back alley, a ditch, the street. Waste was everywhere. It seeped into the soil, the gutters, the air. In cities, it flowed along the edges of roads in shallow channels, accompanied by scraps, runoff, and the occasional dead rat. You stepped around it. You lifted your skirts or your hems. You pretended not to notice. The city smelled like life, and life smelled like something had gone terribly wrong a few days ago and never been cleaned up. The countryside had its own version of waste management. Fields, trees, the edge of the forest. You picked a spot that wasn't cursed, wasn't owned, and wasn't going to result in someone else's boots finding a surprise. Children were trained young. Don't go near the well. Don't go where the goats graze. Don't go near the churchyard unless you want your soul to start falling out early. Castles had guardrobes, stone projections that stuck out over the moat, or a chute that ran down the side of the building. You sat on a wooden seat and let gravity take its course. If you were important, someone might have placed herbs or cloth around the area. If you were very important, someone else might have cleaned it afterward. But for the most part, even nobility had to face the same cold stone and the same draft in winter that made you question every decision that led to that moment. Wiping was another matter. There was no toilet paper. That was a luxury no one had imagined yet. You used what you had: moss, leaves, straw, a rag, a handful of hay, sometimes just water and determination. You learned quickly what was soft and what wasn't, what was safe and what caused infections you couldn't pronounce. Mistakes were made, regrets were had, lessons were passed on, whispered from mother to daughter with the seriousness usually reserved for plague remedies. Public sanitation laws existed in some cities, the kind that told you where you could dump your chamber pot, how far it had to be from the bakery, or how to build a latrine that wouldn't collapse into your neighbour's well. They were written down, posted, occasionally enforced, but mostly ignored. People were tired, pits were full, and the steward in charge of sanitation had probably gone home early with a headache and a vague sense of doom. Disposal was constant. There was always something that needed emptying. Buckets, pans, gutters, privies, slop jars. You carried them carefully. You walked slowly. You developed strong arms and stronger stomachs. And if you spilled, you swore softly and moved on. There was no pause for pity. Just another bucket, another trip, another day where waste management was less a service and more a survival strategy. Illness thrived in this. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera before it had a name. Children died of fevers no one understood. Water turned foul. The smell of the village changed from season to season, but never improved. You learned to live with it. You lit herbs to mask it. You built your home uphill if you could. You said prayers when the wind shifted. Despite all this, there was etiquette. You didn't talk about it during meals. You didn't bring it up in church. You didn't point out the smell unless someone had truly pushed the limits of public tolerance. People kept their heads down. They walked quickly. They blamed animals or neighbours or the weather. If someone asked where the waste went, the answer was usually away, even if away was 3 feet behind the house under a pile of straw. There was also shame. Quiet, persistent. You kept your chamber pot hidden. You cleaned it when you could. You whispered about someone who didn't. You avoided the alley behind the butcher's if you valued your shoes. People judged. Softly. From behind closed shutters. Cleaning tools were basic: ash, vinegar, scrubbing brushes made from twigs, sometimes sand, sometimes just a handful of rags and a sigh. The goal wasn't sterile. The goal was less horrifying. You swished, rinsed, wiped, and poured, and hoped no one tripped over the bucket on their way to bed. Children asked questions. Why does it smell? Where does it go? Who carries it? The answers were short. Because it has to. Because there's nowhere else. Because someone must. And someday, that someone might be you. Monasteries handled it more cleanly, on paper. They had rules, schedules, dedicated latrines and systems for composting. But they also had dozens of men on a single corridor, and not every monk washed his hands, no matter how many psalms he memorized. Faith didn't kill germs, but it gave you something to focus on while you scrubbed your robes for the third time in a week. Still, people found ways to manage. You picked flowers for the table. You burned rosemary by the door. You chewed mint leaves on feast days so your breath wouldn't taste like your chores. You learned to breathe through your mouth when you walked past the pigsty. You learned to forgive the neighbour whose chamber pot always seemed fuller than it should be. You endured. And when someone asked where you were going with that bucket, you said, "Just out," and that was enough. Everyone knew. No one wanted details. You nodded. They nodded. The bucket sloshed softly, and the world went on. Because in the medieval world, waste didn't disappear. It moved. It lingered. It soaked into the edges of the village, into the corners of homes, into the folds of daily life. It was managed with discretion, endurance, and a collective agreement to look the other way. And when someone slipped on the wrong patch of ground, everyone helped them up, silently, without judgment, because everyone had been there, and everyone knew. In a world without plumbing, the most important thing was knowing where to step, and when to pretend you hadn't seen a thing. Pests were not just a problem in the medieval world, they were a feature. You didn't fight them. You coexisted, begrudgingly, quietly, like bad neighbours who used your garden and pretended not to see you. Rats, fleas, flies, lice, worms, beetles, mice. These were part of the landscape, like the hills or the weather. You couldn't remove them. You just hoped they didn't multiply while you were sleeping. The real villain, as we know now, was the flea. Tiny, persistent, often ignored until it was too late. It lived on rats, on people, on animals. It jumped from skin to skin, house to house, village to village. It carried the plague like gossip, whispering it into wounds and warm places. But no one knew this. Not then. You didn't blame the flea. You blamed what you could see. And what you could see were rats and cats, and sometimes women who looked at you strangely. Rats were everywhere. In the fields, in the granaries, in the rafters. They chewed through sacks. They stole your grain. They gave you that feeling of being watched by something that didn't pay rent. You heard them at night. You saw them in the morning. You swore you'd trap them, and then you forgot, because the cow got loose again and the stew boiled dry. Traps were rare. Cats were better. Cats didn't need to be reset. They didn't ask questions. They just appeared, handled the problem, and disappeared again like little furry ghosts with an appetite. Cats were the closest thing to pest control most peasants had. They earned their keep in silence. They patrolled the barns, the haylofts, the dark corners of kitchens. They lived outside, or in the doorway, or anywhere the dog wasn't already snoring. People respected them. People also feared them. Because cats, especially black ones, had a way of showing up when things felt eerie. And in a world where misfortune was never just bad luck, that made them suspicious. The church didn't help. At various points in medieval history, cats were associated with witches, heresy, and the devil himself. Their independence was unsettling. Their eyes glowed. They didn't follow commands. They yowled at night like they were speaking in tongues. That was enough for some to say, demon, which meant people started killing cats. In towns, in cities, sometimes with torches, sometimes with rituals, sometimes just because someone claimed they'd seen one on a roof the night before their uncle got sick. And with the cats gone, the rats flourished. It was the worst trade deal in history. Fleas, meanwhile, thrived. They didn't need permission. They lived in straw beds, in animal fur, in the seams of clothing. They bit ankles. They bit children. They bit the priest during Mass, and he pretended it was divine intervention. Everyone had fleas. You picked them off. You crushed them between your fingernails. You complained. Then you got used to it. You stopped scratching in public. You learned to feel the bite before it happened. There were remedies. Most didn't work. Lavender was burned. Rosemary hung by the door. Sage was tucked into bedding. You slept with garlic under your pillow. You sprinkled ash on the floor. You rubbed vinegar on your skin. You boiled herbs, soaked rags, whispered blessings. The fleas laughed and bit you anyway. Some people washed more, some washed less. Some believed cleanliness attracted pests. Others believed it repelled them. Most simply believed whatever their grandmother had told them, because she was still alive and had probably survived something horrible. Dogs weren't much help. They were lovable, loyal, and just as itchy. They rolled in the same grass, slept on the same floors, and brought back whatever the wind had hidden in the hedges. They chased rats sometimes, but mostly they chased chickens, and the chickens had their own fleas. Pigs had lice. Sheep had mites. Horses had flies. Everything crawled. Everything itched. And when a person got sick, when the lumps appeared, when the fever came, when someone coughed blood into their sleeves, it didn't occur to anyone to look at the flea under their skin. Instead, they looked to the heavens, or the cat, or the strange woman who sold herbs and never smiled during feast days. Witches were blamed because they were convenient. They were usually old, often single, sometimes blind in one eye, or good with animals, or born under an unlucky moon. They were blamed for milk going sour, for sheep being stillborn, for fevers that lingered, and bread that didn't rise. If the plague came through and you'd recently argued with a woman who smelled like rosemary and walked alone, well, people started sharpening sticks. Pest control, then, was less a science and more a collection of rituals, fears, and frantic broom swinging. You tried to keep your food covered. You stored grain in jars. You smoked meat. You swept. You aired the bedding. You beat the rugs until the fleas fell out, or until your arms gave up, whichever came first. Some cities paid men to walk the streets with sticks, poking through refuse, lifting sewer grates, dragging out dead animals. It didn't help much, but it made people feel better. A sign that someone was doing something, even if that something involved prodding a pile of rotting straw while pretending not to vomit. Pestilence was a word that covered everything. Plague, infestation, an overall sense that something was wrong and multiplying. You prayed against it. You fasted. You made pilgrimages. You bought charms, bits of bone, blessed ribbons, little bags filled with salt and hope. You hung them by the door. You whispered to them in the night. You looked your child in the eyes and told them not to touch any dead birds. And still, the rats came. The fleas fed. The plague moved on. Because the truth was simple. No one could see the real danger. Fleas were too small, too common, too boring. And in a world where people believed illness came from sin, or from bad smells, or from the alignment of planets, you didn't need a microscope. You needed someone to blame. So you burned the cat, or the woman, or both. And the rats ran wild, and the fleas spread faster, and the bodies piled up. Only later, much later, did we realize the irony. That the animals we feared were the ones keeping the real danger at bay. That the cat we chased from the doorstep was the only thing standing between us and a room full of plague-ridden rodents. That the problem wasn't the creature with glowing eyes. It was the thing so small it went unseen until it left a blackened body behind. But that was hindsight. In the moment, you lit the fire, closed the door, and told yourself the village would be safer now. You slept easier, until the scratching began again. Because pests weren't just a nuisance, they were a mirror. They showed you how fragile everything was, how quickly a home could be overrun, how little control you really had. You could sweep, you could boil herbs, you could lay traps and mutter prayers. But in the end, you weren't the one in charge. They were. Before germ theory, before microscopes, before the discovery that invisible things could ruin your week, medieval people did their best to understand why bodies failed. Why a child coughed until he stopped breathing. Why a wound went black. Why a woman with good posture and strong hands fell over in the garden and never got back up. The answers weren't scientific, but they were sincere, imaginative, and occasionally set something on fire. The leading theory was miasma, bad air. Illness came from smells. If it stank, it made you sick. If it really stank, it might kill you. The logic was straightforward. Corpses smelled bad. Rotten food smelled bad. Swamps smelled bad. People got sick near all of those things. Therefore, stink equals sickness. You didn't catch a fever from someone coughing on you. You caught it from standing near a puddle that smelled like boiled regret. To protect yourself, you masked the scent. Herbs were stuffed in sleeves, tied around your neck, hung in doorways, burned over coals. People walked around with oranges pierced with cloves, like little citrus grenades of hope. Plague doctors, yes, the ones with the beaked masks, filled those beaks with flowers, spices, and vinegar-soaked cloth. They weren't being dramatic. They were trying not to die. Some towns ordered piles of fragrant things burned in the streets. Juniper, rosemary, pine, sulphur. One mayor famously ordered 100 barrels of herbs lit on fire in a single night. The air turned thick with smoke and rose petals. No one could breathe. It was deemed a success. Windows were shuttered, doors sealed, clothes smoked over fires, streets swept with vinegar. People avoided the sick, not because they feared contagion, but because they feared the stench. A dying man's final breath was thought to release poison into the air, mourning, but make it toxic. Another popular explanation was humoral imbalance. The body, they believed, contained 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When these were in harmony, you were healthy. When they weren't, you turned purple, screamed about angels, and died in your nightshirt. The goal of medicine was to restore balance, not through kindness, but through leeching, purging, and making you bleed until you stopped complaining. If you had a fever, you had too much blood. Solution: remove some. A barber surgeon would arrive with a knife, a cloth, and way too much confidence. Bloodletting was common, accepted, and about as effective as opening a wine cask to fix a leak. It didn't cure you, but it gave you something else to worry about. Phlegm was the villain in colds, coughs, and people who sighed too much. Remedies included hot broth, garlic, and prayers said through a mouthful of steam. Yellow bile was associated with anger, black bile with melancholy. If you were too sad, you were told to look at something yellow and drink something bitter. If you were angry, you were told to fast and avoid fennel. It wasn't medicine. It was poetry with side effects. Doctors, if you had access to one, based their advice on astrology, patient colour, and occasionally dreams. They might diagnose you with excess heat in the liver or dampness of the soul. They scribbled things in Latin and handed you a bag of dried roots. They had no idea what was happening, but they wore long robes and talked with certainty. That was enough. Clergy offered spiritual explanations. Illness came from sin, pride, lust, greed. Pick your vice. If you were sick, it meant God was watching and had taken notes. The solution wasn't a tonic, it was penance, pilgrimage, confession, flagellation, if you were feeling committed. You whipped your back. You wept publicly. You promised to stop whatever it was you hadn't realized you were doing wrong. If you recovered, It worked. If you died, well, at least your soul was cleaner. Some illnesses were blamed on witchcraft. That woman who lived near the woods and kept bees? Suspicious. The midwife whose remedies worked too well? Dangerous. People whispered. If someone got sick after crossing your path, it wasn't chance. It was you. And while you were boiling herbs and offering soup, someone was drawing a crowd to discuss whether your eyes blinked too slowly. The moon, too, was a suspect. Phases mattered. A full moon could cause madness. A waning moon was bad luck. Certain days were more dangerous than others. You timed your treatments accordingly. Bleeding during the wrong phase could make everything worse. Or summon demons. No one was entirely sure. People also blamed immoderate emotions. Too much sorrow weakened the heart. Too much laughter disturbed the lungs. You were advised to stay balanced. Not too sad. Not too joyful. A little mournful. A touch amused. The medieval ideal personality was basically haunted, but polite. There were treatments, many of them heroic in their effort and horrifying in execution. You drank urine, your own or someone else's. You rubbed onions on wounds, boiled in vinegar, and bound with cloth. You took powders made from crushed beetles, ground bones, or baked toads. You ingested mercury, believing it would push the sickness out. It did. Along with most of your organs. Bathing was controversial. Some thought it opened your pores to disease. Others thought it cleansed the bad air. So you might bathe during illness, or after it, or not at all. No one agreed. Everyone had an uncle with a story. Spells were cast, amulets worn, saints invoked. Saint Sebastian for plague, Saint Apollonia for toothaches, Saint Roch if you had a dog and a suspicious rash. You lit candles, you fasted, you promised to be better. The plague did not care. Sometimes you burned a whole house. If the sickness wouldn't leave, you drove it out with smoke and flame. People fled villages, leaving behind everything they owned except guilt. They isolated the sick in huts or barns. Sometimes they returned to find the building empty. Sometimes they didn't return at all. But through all of it, through bleeding, praying, sweating, purging, people hoped that something would work, that the smell would clear, that the moon would shift, that the saint would listen. They didn't understand microbes, but they understood patterns. They watched, they remembered, they passed down stories. And sometimes, by luck or sheer stubbornness, people survived. They recovered. They stood again. They walked to the well and remembered what the air had smelled like the day before they got sick. They didn't know why they lived, but they boiled the water anyway. They burned more rosemary. They told their children to avoid the swamp in midsummer, because the body was a mystery. The world was a test. Illness was everywhere. And if something smelled bad, you held your breath. But if something smelled worse, like vinegar, garlic, or burning sage, you leaned in. Because maybe, just maybe, the cure had to outstink the disease. When it came to hygiene, medieval nobles didn't exactly smell better. They just smelled more intentional. They weren't cleaner than peasants. They were simply covered in more layers of scent, silk, and plausible deniability. The result was a kind of curated grime. Like if dirt had a publicist. If a bath felt risky, they'd skip it. If perfume felt holy, they'd bathe in that instead. The wealthy didn't avoid water entirely, but they avoided questionable water, which in medieval Europe was basically all of it. A noble might bathe once a month, maybe twice a year, maybe after a particularly sweaty crusade. Bathing was viewed with suspicion, especially warm water. The heat opened your pores. Illness, it was believed, snuck in like a thief. So if you weren't already sick, a bath might do the job. That said, nobles had access. To tubs, to servants, to privacy, which was its own luxury. Their baths were large wooden barrels or carved stone basins, often lined with linen and filled with warm water scented with herbs, oils, or crushed flowers. Sometimes milk, if you were royalty, or wine, if you were trying to cure a rash and impress someone at the same time. They soaked. They sighed. They got out quickly before the air turned treacherous. Servants carried in the water, bucket by bucket. They also carried it out. This meant a bath involved coordination, physical labour, and someone standing nearby with a towel and a haunted expression. It wasn't relaxing. It was ceremonial. A demonstration that you could afford to waste water and time. And after the bath, everything was powdered, to mask the fact that you'd be skipping the next 5. Cleanliness for the nobility was more about appearances than results. You wore clean linen undergarments. These absorbed sweat. You changed those more often than your outerwear, which might be brushed, beaten, or quietly burned. If you looked fresh and didn't collapse mid-sentence, people assumed you were clean. You cultivated the illusion. Hair was brushed, styled, covered, and sometimes shaved entirely beneath a carefully balanced headdress. Wigs weren't yet in full fashion, but powdered scalps were. Head lice were so common that a comb on your belt was considered standard attire. Some nobles had grooming servants, whose job was to inspect, pluck, and pretend not to notice the scratching. Perfume was everything. Scented oils, pomanders, small metal spheres filled with spices and herbs, hung from belts or carried in hand. Gloves were perfumed. Handkerchiefs too. The rich didn't wash their hands before eating. They simply held something that smelled better. Their fingers might be sticky, but their gloves reeked of cloves and sanctimony. Royalty took it further. The king might wash his hands in rosewater before and after meals, but not because he was clean, because it was expected. Cleanliness was performative. He might bathe in a marble tub once a season, surrounded by musicians and attendants, and a priest to bless the towels. The water was changed. The protocol was not. Monks had their own rituals. Cleanliness was tied to godliness. Sort of. Many orders required regular washing of hands, feet, and sometimes faces. Baths were permitted, especially in infirmaries, but not encouraged to the point of enjoyment. Some monks took pride in their odour, a mark of humility, a sign that the body didn't rule the soul. Others took pride in neatness, clean robes, combed hair, polished sandals. It depended on the abbey, and whether the abbot had a sensitive nose. Even in monasteries, cleanliness had limits. A shared towel for 30 men, 1 bar of soap the size of a walnut, a single bathhouse for an entire complex. You learned to rinse efficiently. You also learned not to stand downwind from Brother Thomas after lentils. Tooth care among the rich was slightly better, but only because they had access to more expensive forms of disaster. They rubbed teeth with crushed coral, burnt bread, or vinegar-soaked twigs. Some used toothpicks made of silver. Others rinsed with wine or herbs. It didn't help, but it looked impressive. Breath was covered with sugar pastilles, chewed pellets made from honey, spices, and regret. They didn't clean your mouth. They just made it taste like cinnamon death. Still, better than nothing, which was what most peasants had. Royal bedsheets were changed often, but not by the people sleeping in them. The rich had bedding rotated weekly, sometimes more. But the bed itself, the mattress, the feather-stuffed mound of privilege, was rarely cleaned. It simply absorbed the sins of 100 restless nights and hoped no one lifted the top sheet too quickly. There were also medical beliefs to support the rich person's version of clean. A body that smelled sweet was healthy, a foul-smelling one was not, unless you were healing. Then it was part of the process, sweating out demons, puking out sin. You were either clean or you were purging, no in between. Bathhouses for the wealthy were private. For the almost wealthy, they were public, but expensive. Attendants scrubbed your back, musicians played in the corner, herbs floated on the surface of the water, and the person 2 tubs down might be plotting your downfall while lathering their elbows. It was politics with soap. When illness swept through, the rich had options. They burned their bedding. They fumigated their rooms with sulphur. They shaved their heads and blamed the peasants. Physicians were summoned. Bleeding commenced. Vinegar-soaked rags were applied to every orifice. Candles were lit, curtains drawn, and someone whispered that perhaps a bath was due, then immediately regretted it. Cleanliness among the elite was also about contrast. You didn't need to be objectively clean. You just had to be cleaner than the people serving you. And if they smelled too strongly, they were replaced. If you smelled too strongly, you simply bought stronger perfume. Some nobles took it too far. Bathed daily, brushed teeth with imported powders, boiled clothes. These people were considered eccentric, possibly dangerous, obsessed with the body in a way that hinted at heresy or hidden guilt. No one trusted someone who liked soap that much. And still, beneath the lace and silk and perfumed gloves, the rich were just as vulnerable to rot, infection, and plague. Disease didn't care how expensive your tunic was. It spread through drafts, through hands, through fleas, tucked into fur-lined boots. Death didn't knock politely. It kicked the door in wearing slippers you had made in Italy. But at least you looked good when it arrived. At least your gloves smelled like violets. Your skin was powdered. Your boots were shined. You died surrounded by scented cloth and 3 candles, and someone weeping softly over the rosewater basin. Because that was noble hygiene. Not about health. Not really. It was about dignity, about status, about never being seen at your worst, even if your worst had been living in your hair for weeks. There comes a point where washing your hands just isn't enough, where soap becomes meaningless, where order breaks down, not with a scream, but with a cough, and a second, wetter cough, and then silence. When the Black Death arrived, it didn't just kill people. It killed the idea that the world made sense, and it didn't care if you were clean. In 1347, the plague sailed into Europe on ships and rats, and the backs of fleas too small to fear. Within months, cities were unravelling. Within a year, entire villages vanished. People died so fast, the church ran out of candles and excuses. And in the middle of it all, hygiene, the thing you'd been told might keep you safe, simply gave up. The first to go was the bathhouse. Once a place for gossip and awkward nudity, it quickly became a suspected death trap. People stopped bathing, not out of laziness, but out of self-preservation. Water opened your pores, they said. The plague slipped in like smoke. So you stayed dry. You let the dirt settle. You wrapped yourself in your own scent and called it wisdom. Perfume sales skyrocketed. Not officially. There were no receipts. But you could smell it. People burned herbs in every room. They stuffed flowers into their sleeves, their hoods, their mouths. Oranges studded with cloves hung from belts like talismans. The goal wasn't freshness. It was protection. If you could overpower the bad smell, maybe the bad air couldn't find you. Miasma ruled. The belief that illness floated in on foul smells. If something reeked, it was dangerous. If it reeked worse, it might be the cure. People lit bonfires of rosemary and sage in the streets. They walked through clouds of sulphur, then went home and threw up from the stench, convinced they had just spared themselves a much worse fate. No one could breathe. Everyone was relieved. Waste piled up. Chamber pots weren't emptied. Streets overflowed. The few public latrines that existed were avoided like cursed wells. People no longer asked where the smell was coming from. The answer was, everywhere. The gutters ran thick. The wells ran foul. And no one dared to clean, because cleaning meant touching something. Bodies didn't disappear politely. They sprawled in alleys, in beds, in churches, under windows, beside wells. Grave carts rattled down the roads, pulled by men who had stopped praying 3 days ago and hadn't slept since. The bell rang constantly. Then it didn't, because the bell ringer was gone. The streets were quieter after that, but only in sound. Grave diggers gave up, not out of cruelty, out of math. There were too many, too fast, too everywhere. Trenches were dug, bodies tossed in, dirt was shoveled, crosses were forgotten. Some were buried in their clothes, some without. Some still clutched family, some were never claimed. If you wanted a proper burial, you had to die early. The plague did not reward procrastinators. In homes, water turned stale. Firewood ran out. The sick lay in bed, untouched because no one wanted to join them. No one washed their face. No one cleaned the floor. The air thickened. Food spoiled. Rats grew bold. And no one moved fast enough to stop them. Doctors came, but not to heal. They came in long robes, gloves, and those now famous beaked masks filled with herbs. They didn't touch. They didn't comfort. They pointed. They inspected. They left. Their presence meant you had days, maybe hours. They were symbols of death wrapped in logic. If someone coughed, the room emptied. If they bled, you screamed. If the lumps came, black, bulging and hot to the touch, you closed the door and moved to the barn. Families broke, parents fled, children were left behind. Love didn't disappear, but it got very quiet, very fast. The rich fared no better. They fled the cities, carrying fleas and fear to the countryside. They locked their doors. They banned visitors. They burned incense until the walls turned brown. But the plague found them. Through the servants, through the floorboards, through the things they couldn't see and hadn't thought to fear. Monks fell in rows. Priests stopped visiting the dying. Mass was whispered to empty rooms. Holy water was replaced with dry blessings, and the quiet hope that someone was still listening. Bodies were stacked behind altars. Crosses were carved into doors. Faith did not disappear, but it coughed. Funerals became group projects, if they happened at all. A priest said a prayer over 12, 20, 50 bodies. No names, no hymns, just a fast Latin murmur and a shovel. The families wept until they stopped. Not because they didn't care, because they had nothing left. Cleanliness collapsed. There was no one to boil the linens, no one to sweep, no one to scrub the stairs. Hygiene became mythical. The idea of being clean felt ancient. You wiped your hands on a wall. You rinsed your mouth with wine. You hoped the dirt kept you grounded, like armour. Even the animals noticed. Dogs went feral. Cats left. Birds fell silent. The pigs were too quiet, or too loud. And the rats multiplied. The fleas cheered. No one could see them, but everyone itched. Lice returned in force. Bedbugs came back. The straw beds writhed with life. And yet, sleep was a blessing. Rumours spread. About cures. About causes. A cursed well. A comet. A foreign merchant. A sin too great to name. People lit candles and whispered new prayers. They tied ribbons to saints. They bled themselves. They drank vinegar. They burned every herb they could find and blamed whatever didn't catch fire. Order failed. Villages locked their gates. Cities closed their walls. People turned away from each other in the street. Children hid. Mothers shook. Fathers stopped coming home from work. And in every home, the question lingered. How do you clean a world that's already dying? And still, some tried. A cloth over the mouth. A handful of mint. Washing the body of the dead. Just once more. Because it felt like the last thing you could do that mattered. A basin of warm water. A clean shirt. A candle. Because cleanliness in the end wasn't about health. Not during the plague. It was about control. About dignity. About pretending that the world hadn't slipped entirely out of your hands. You couldn't stop the rats. You couldn't stop the lumps. But you could scrub the floor one last time. You could wipe your child's face. You could change the sheets. You could light the fire and pretend it was for warmth. When the plague passed, if it passed, You were left with the silence. The smell lingered. The tools were rusted. The water was low, but the basin was still there. The soap, hardened in the corner. The towel, stiff with weeks of neglect. You didn't rush. You stood. You breathed. You dipped your hands in water, cold and cloudy, and began again. Because there was no great recovery, no trumpet, no sudden return to shining white linens and lavender soap, just 1,000 small acts of resistance. Washing a face, emptying a bucket, burning the bedding, refusing to let the dirt decide who you were now, because you had survived, and that meant, somehow, the world might be clean again. The thing about medieval public health is that it wasn't really public, and it wasn't particularly healthy. It was more of a collective shrug, dressed up in incense and whispered prayers. But then the plague came, fast, loud, and leaking from every corner of the body, and suddenly the world started experimenting with something that looked suspiciously like a plan. Not science, not policy, more like panic that remembered to lock the door behind itself. The idea of quarantine didn't begin with a scientific breakthrough. It began with Venice, and it began with fear. In 1348, ships started docking with cargo that coughed. Sailors were sick. Rats were twitchy. People on shore started dying before the wine even finished unloading. So the Venetians did something shocking. They waited. They made ships sit offshore for 40 days, 40 giorni, before anyone could disembark. That was it. Quarantine, invented by bureaucracy and blind optimism. Did it work? Sometimes. When people actually waited the full 40 days and didn't sneak ashore for lunch halfway through, it slowed things down. Just enough to notice. Just enough for other cities to say, "Oh, maybe we should do that too," followed immediately by, "But not yet. It sounds expensive." Elsewhere, the concept caught on slowly. Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, copied the idea. Milan took it a step further and bricked up entire houses, with the sick still inside. Effective, yes. Humane, no. England mostly ignored the idea. They were too busy blaming foreigners, sheep, and whatever star had blinked at the wrong time in the sky last Tuesday. Still, fear did what policy couldn't. Towns closed gates. Inns refused travellers. Villages posted lookouts at crossroads with instructions to wave arms and scream if anyone unfamiliar approached. It was social distancing, medieval edition. No signs, no charts. Just a man with a pitchfork shouting, "Not today." Isolation became survival. If someone in your house got sick, you didn't call for help. You stopped answering the door. The family withdrew. Neighbours delivered bread to the doorstep and said prayers from the fence line. You lit a candle. You whispered. You waited. If the fever broke, you thanked the saints. If it didn't, you buried fast and quietly and scrubbed everything with vinegar. Peasants didn't move much to begin with. Travel was rare, risky, and mostly hypothetical. The average villager might live and die within 5 miles of their birthplace. When the plague hit, this accidental immobility became a sort of safety net. You weren't isolated because of policy. You were isolated because your donkey had arthritis and the forest was full of wolves. But cities were chaos with walls. People packed tight, markets overflowing, no sanitation, no exits that weren't already watched by guards who'd seen too much. When things got bad, the rich fled first. The poor were left behind, to nurse the sick, bury the dead, and try to remember what the city had smelled like before. If they remembered quarantine, it was only because someone had locked the gate and tossed the key in a moat. There were rules, of course. Some towns required a certificate of health to enter, signed, stamped, and probably forged. Others set up pest houses outside the city walls. These were quarantine stations in theory, death sentences in practice. You were sent there with food, water, and a prayer. If you came back, it was assumed the plague was over. Or you were very stubborn. Some physicians started taking notes, observing, recording patterns. Cities noticed that sickness followed trade routes, that it travelled faster with travellers, that shutting the port slowed the death toll, eventually. These weren't germs yet. No one said pathogen. But the idea was forming, that maybe, just maybe, the invisible had rules. Herbs were still burned. Incense wafted through empty cathedrals. Streets were washed in vinegar. But something else had begun. The art of containment. The idea that sickness wasn't just divine punishment, but a thing that moved, that spread, that could be slowed if you just stood far enough away and didn't breathe too deeply. Letters were quarantined, clothes burned, markets banned foreigners. Trade was rerouted, sometimes delayed for weeks. Cities passed ordinances. No visiting the sick, no gathering at funerals, no shouting in public because open mouths made people nervous. Fear turned into policy, policy turned into habit, and somewhere in all of it, people realised not everything had to smell like rosemary to be useful. Still, it was uneven. Some towns enforced quarantine with guards and gallows. Others said quarantine and meant don't sneeze on the mayor. Results varied. Some cities emptied too fast. Others waited too long. Some shut the gates and sealed their fate inside. Isolation changed people. Families turned inward. Priests stopped visiting the dying. Friends became names shouted across fences. Children stayed inside. Elders were hidden. Meals were shared through windows. You didn't hug. You didn't kiss. You didn't touch. Cleanliness became distance. Not a basin of water, a length of air. And in a strange way, it worked. Not every time, not in every village, but in enough places that the world began to whisper the word quarantine, like it was something sacred, something serious, something real. It didn't save everyone, it didn't even save most, but it gave people something to do, something that looked like hope. People learned to listen for coughs, to spot fevers early, to spot who had stopped coming to the well. You learned which houses had closed their shutters, which smoke no longer rose from the chimney. You didn't ask. You left bread. You moved on. Cleanliness, as a concept, shifted. It wasn't just washing anymore. It was space. It was absence. It was the door that stayed closed, the road that stayed empty, the friend who didn't visit because they still loved you. And yet, even after the plague passed, the rituals lingered. Ships still waited in harbour. Streets were still swept with vinegar during outbreaks. The idea that disease could be stopped, not prayed away but planned around, had taken root. No one called it public health, but it looked suspiciously like it. The poor didn't invent quarantine, but they practiced it by default. The rich didn't invent isolation, but they perfected it, usually from a second home in the countryside. And between the two, a new kind of hygiene was born, not of soap and water, but of boundaries. Who you touched, who you trusted, who you let inside. Venice figured it out first. England caught on late. Most peasants never needed convincing. They'd already learned to stay where the fleas weren't and hope that someone upstream was washing their hands. When water was scarce, soap was expensive, and rats were getting too familiar with your pantry, you didn't just wash your hands, you washed your soul, or at least tried. Because if you couldn't scrub away the dirt, you could always try to rinse out the sin. In the medieval world, spiritual hygiene was a full-time occupation, and unlike soap, it was free if you said it loud enough. The church didn't just tell you how to pray, it told you how to clean. Not your floors, not your feet, your conscience. And it came with its own toolkit. Candles, ashes, incense, saints, pilgrimages, fasting, penance, and enough ritual to make you forget your cottage had only one working bucket and a suspicious smell in the corner. Cleanliness, you were told, wasn't just about looking presentable for the feast day. It was about being worthy of the feast in the first place. Dirt on the skin was expected. Dirt on the soul? That needed immediate attention, preferably before Mass, ideally before death. It began with prayer, the ultimate all-purpose scrub, said before meals, after meals, during illness, after sneezing, and basically any time someone looked even slightly concerned about your chances of salvation. You prayed to be forgiven. You prayed to stay healthy. You prayed your neighbour's cow wasn't possessed. Prayer was less about cleanliness and more about signalling that you were trying. Next came confession, the medieval equivalent of spiritual laundry day. You showed up, hunched over, listed everything you'd done or thought about doing that might offend God, your neighbour, or the local reeve. The priest listened, sighed, assigned penance, and maybe told you to fast for 3 days and say 20 Hail Marys while facing uphill. You left feeling lighter, cleaner, mildly judged, but forgiven. Probably. If that didn't work, you had pilgrimage. A long walk in uncomfortable shoes toward a place where someone holy had once sneezed or bled or dropped a particularly blessed comb. You trudged through fields, mud, and spiritual doubt, hoping the miles would wear away your misdeeds like sandpaper on the soul. Pilgrimage wasn't just exercise, it was penance with blisters. You arrived, lit a candle, kissed something relic adjacent, and hoped the saint was in a good mood. And if you couldn't afford a pilgrimage, there were always holy days. Days marked on the church calendar, not just for fasting, but for spiritual fumigation. You bathed, if water was available. You changed clothes, if you had another set. You stood in church shoulder to shoulder with your neighbours and collectively tried to look cleaner than you felt. On Ash Wednesday, you were marked with ashes. On Easter, you were scrubbed in the blood of the Lamb, metaphorically. On every other day, you carried the weight of knowing your soul probably needed a touch-up. Incense was part of the package, burned during Mass, wafted over the altar, swung dramatically in brass censers by monks who looked both reverent and slightly exhausted. The smell didn't just cover the scent of the unwashed faithful. It was meant to purify, to lift your prayers, to remind everyone that God could smell your intentions and would prefer if they came with a hint of frankincense. Then there were relics, bits of bone, fabric, hair, or even teeth, claimed to belong to saints, martyrs, or the particularly holy. People travelled miles to see them, to touch them, to stand near them, and hope that some of the holiness might rub off. You didn't need logic, you needed contact. That bit of wood, from the true cross. That toe, definitely not from a pig. That cloth, soaked in the blood of a martyr, or at least something red. These objects weren't washed. They were preserved, protected, held behind glass or wood or under cloth. Cleanliness wasn't the point. Holiness was. They weren't sterile, they were sacred. And if you stood close enough, said the right words, and dropped the right coin into the box, you might leave spiritually polished. For the ill, blessings replaced medicine. A cross drawn over the forehead. A prayer whispered against the skin. Oil touched to the brow. No soap, no surgery, just divine attention. If you survived, it was proof the ritual worked. If not, well, your soul was clean, so it counted. Some took it further. Flagellants roamed from town to town, beating themselves with ropes, whips, or sticks to atone for the world's sins. They walked barefoot. They bled publicly. They sang hymns. They terrified children. The church was not always pleased, but the crowd loved it. Watching someone else suffer was always spiritually reassuring. During plagues, spiritual hygiene went into overdrive. Bells rang. Prayers echoed. Altars filled with candles. The sick were blessed. The dying were absolved. And the cleanest thing in town was the priest's hands, waved frantically in every direction. People confessed more, fasted longer, paid for masses, donated to the church, Not because they thought it would cure them, but because it might save them from dying dirty. Because that was the fear. Not just dying, but dying unclean, without confession, without penance, without a chance to wash your soul one more time. You didn't need a bath. You needed a prayer. You needed to be remembered as someone who tried. Even if your clothes were filthy, your boots cracked, and your breath smelled like desperation. For the poor, this was the only hygiene that mattered. They had no soap, no warm water, no linen. But they had saints. They had stories. They had the church. You might die covered in mud, but if your name was said at Mass, your soul might still shine. You couldn't afford to be clean, but you could afford to be forgiven. The church reinforced it. Suffering was holy. Pain was purifying. Filth on your body was fine if your soul was spotless. You didn't need a physician. You needed a priest. And if your house stank and your shirt was stiff with sweat, but your conscience was clear, then you were, in a strange and solemn way, pure. And so people knelt. They prayed. They lit incense. They whispered the names of saints before sleep. They crossed themselves when passing graves. They covered mirrors during storms. They avoided cursing during meals. They wore crosses, carried amulets, kissed relics, and kept holy water in bottles that had never once been cleaned. Because in a world where water made you sick, where bathing might kill you, where plague didn't care how often you changed your shirt, the one kind of clean that still felt possible was the one you couldn't see. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. They didn't wear white aprons. They didn't get titles. They didn't write books. But if anyone in the medieval world ever survived a fever, a childbirth, or a goat-related incident, it was probably because a woman was standing nearby with a wet cloth, an herb-stuffed pouch, and the kind of exhausted patience that comes from being everyone's first and final nurse. Women were the hygiene system no one officially acknowledged. While the world argued about bad air and humours and which planet was currently making your nose bleed, women were boiling water, sewing wounds, changing bandages, and quietly muttering, "I told you not to go barefoot in the stable." They didn't wait for permission. They just worked. Most of it wasn't glamorous. In fact, none of it was. It was messy, repetitive, and involved more bodily fluids than anyone wanted to admit. They cleaned linens. They washed sores. They rubbed backs. They sat beside the sick until the fever broke, or the light faded, or both. Then they rose, rinsed their hands, and started on the next patient. There were no uniforms, no degrees, just knowledge passed down from mother to daughter, sister to sister, neighbour to neighbour. A midwife didn't have a certificate. She had calloused hands, sharp eyes, and stories that could make a priest sweat. She had delivered babies, buried them, treated coughs, crushed herbs, chewed garlic, and boiled linen bandages over fires that barely stayed lit. These women knew how to mix lard with ash for salves. They knew which leaves to wrap around a swollen joint, which bark to boil for pain, which herbs to burn to scare away spirits, or mosquitoes, depending on the day. They knew which teas made you sleep and which ones made you vomit, on purpose. They didn't call it medicine. They called it helping. In households, women were the ones who cleaned the chamber pots, aired the bedding, swept the rushes, and dragged children out of puddles they'd just warned them about. They scraped food off the floor before it fermented. They pulled lice from scalps with combs and fingernails. They cut bread and infection with the same knife, wiping it between uses on a rag that had once been a tunic. They were responsible for childbirth and everything that followed. They delivered babies in smoky rooms, on straw beds, with only towels, hot water, and sheer nerve. They stitched tears. They buried stillbirths. They wept when they had time, and when they didn't, they kept moving. A new mother needed soup. A toddler had a rash. Someone's old uncle had swallowed a splinter again. Clean wasn't about sparkle. It was about survival. A cloth boiled just long enough. A wound rinsed with wine because water might kill faster. A floor swept because that's where the baby crawls now. It was practical, relentless, invisible. Which meant, of course, it wasn't written down. Historians remembered kings, battles, and the occasional fancy doctor who prescribed ground emeralds and made things worse. They didn't remember the woman who held the feverish hand for 3 days straight, or who stayed behind to clean the bed after the priest left with the last rites and a faint smell of incense. Midwives in particular were powerful in a way that made everyone nervous. They saw bodies in states no one else dared to. They touched blood, bone, and breath. They knew when something wasn't right before anyone else did, and sometimes they could fix it. That made them essential. It also made them suspect. If a baby died, people whispered. If a woman bled too much, the midwife got looks. If the wrong herbs were used, or the right ones worked too well, accusations followed. Witchcraft was never far from medicine. And if a woman was too confident, too quiet, or too good at her work, the firewood stack behind the church got a little taller. But most days, people trusted them. Because they had to. Because there wasn't anyone else. The physician was 2 towns away and only treated those who paid. The priest could pray, but not stitch. The steward could take a census, but not pulse. So you called the midwife, the widow, the aunt, the girl who knew how to pack a poultice that didn't sting too much. You sat back and you let her work, and work she did, through cold, hunger, blood, grief, through screams and silence and every prayer you forgot until the moment you needed it. She taught you to boil the cloth, not just rinse it, to bury the dead quickly but kindly, to hold the baby upright when it wheezed, to bite a stick when it hurt too much to scream. She did the chores, then the healing, then more chores. She cut herbs with the same hands that churned butter. She changed dressings and diapers in the same hour. She didn't rest unless forced. She didn't stop unless someone else could take over, and often no one could. And in all that, she kept a kind of order. Not the grand, official kind, the domestic, humble kind. The rhythm of waking, cleaning, feeding, tending. She kept the house from turning into a cave. She kept the sick from feeling forgotten. She kept the dying from dying alone. And when the world spun off its axis, plague, war, famine, she adjusted. She wrapped tighter, stirred more, hid her fear under layers of fabric and certainty. There was no glory in it, no fame. But people remembered, not always by name, but by shape. The one who stayed, the one who helped, the one who knew what to do when the coughing started. Stories passed down, not written, but spoken, from fire to fire, bedside to bedside. She told me to chew this root. She said to boil it first. She saved the baby when no one else could. They weren't saints. They were tired, wise, sometimes bitter, often funny in that way people get when they've seen too much and don't have the luxury of dramatic exits. They lived long enough to teach someone else. That was the goal. Not applause, continuity. So when we talk about hygiene in the medieval world, we can list the bathhouses, the saints, the sulphur. But none of it worked without them. The women who knew where the clean cloth was, who boiled water before it was trendy, who didn't need a lecture about germs to know that dirt in a wound was a bad idea, who kept people alive just long enough to be remembered in the histories they never got to write. Change doesn't come because people want it. It comes because everything else has collapsed. After the Black Death had done its work, had emptied villages, silenced bells, and made priests nervous to sneeze in public, the survivors were left with a problem. The same streets, the same smells, and suddenly, a lot fewer people to walk around pretending it wasn't a problem. So they started over. Not dramatically, no big speeches, no clean-swept Renaissance courtyards overnight. just slow, practical, often accidental changes. Because when half your neighbours are gone and your baker has stopped showing up, you begin to wonder if maybe the rats shouldn't be allowed inside the granary after all. The first thing to shift was attitude. People didn't suddenly believe in germs. They didn't know what those were. But they began to believe in prevention. Not health, not science. Just the growing realization that corpses in the street might be a sign your city needs new policies. Cities that once tolerated waste as a sort of ambient hazard began looking around and saying, maybe we should clean something. Anything. Urban reforms began, not out of idealism, but out of exhaustion. The smell couldn't be ignored anymore. The guilt couldn't be pushed off on witches or sailors. You couldn't just light more incense and pretend the gutters weren't squelching. You had to act, or at least hire someone else to act and then complain about the results. Some towns created sanitation roles, officials whose job it was to oversee waste removal, monitor wells, and shout at people who tried to bury a goat behind the fishmonger's stall. These weren't glamorous jobs. They involved more pointing than prestige. But they existed, which was new. And they had titles: scavengers, rakers, gong farmers. The kind of name you didn't boast about, but that kept you employed while everyone else was dying or praying or both. Streets started being swept. Not well, not often, but swept. Gutters were cleared with sticks and grim determination. Slaughterhouses were moved out of the main market squares. Wells were covered. Latrines were dug deeper. In some cities, ordinances appeared, written ones, with actual fines. Throw your waste out the window? Pay up. Dump your dead pig in the river? Double fine. Refuse to remove your deceased cousin from the front step? That'll cost extra. It didn't stop all the filth, but it shifted the baseline. Before, dirt was background noise. Now it was a reminder of death, of fear, of how quickly things could fall apart when no one was watching the drainage ditch. Cities like Milan, which had survived the plague better than most, became the poster children for public enforcement. They had sealed infected homes, enforced quarantine, cleaned streets with actual urgency. People noticed, so other cities, reluctantly, followed suit. Not because they admired Milan, but because no one wanted to be the next cautionary tale on a merchant's lips. Hospitals changed too, slowly. They were still mostly for the poor, the dying, or the spiritually questionable. But more emphasis was placed on separation, on ventilation, on washing hands, sometimes with water that had seen herbs and sunlight in the same week. Cleanliness became not just moral, but functional. You couldn't afford to lose any more monks to infections that started in the infirmary and ended in the chapel. The church, for all its incense and ashes, took note. Monasteries began enforcing stricter washing routines. Priests were taught to clean the tools of mass. Pilgrimage sites, once piled with unwashed bodies hoping for a miracle, installed water stations and regulated crowds. Relics were still kissed, but at least someone thought to wipe them between pilgrims. In homes, survivors began doing little things differently. Airing out bedding, burning herbs with fewer expectations and more routine, washing hands after touching animals, not throwing things into the street if someone was watching. The kinds of shifts that don't make headlines but keep your child from chewing on a piece of old turnip someone sneezed on. Women led most of this, quietly, again. They didn't publish treatises. They just stopped letting the toddler play in the refuse pile. They boiled more water. They rinsed cloth longer. They scraped the floor even if no one had spilled stew, and they taught others to do the same, so that clean wasn't just something you were for Easter, but something you tried to be most days of the week. Trade guilds started enforcing rules too. Bakers kept their ovens clean. Butchers had to dispose of offal farther away. Tanneries were banished to the edge of town, where their smells could offend only birds. Not because of some awakening of civic duty, but because customers got picky when they'd just buried a cousin who drank from the wrong puddle. And then there were the cemeteries. Expanded, regulated, fenced. The mass graves from the plague years didn't disappear, but they were slowly replaced with burials that remembered names, headstones, space between plots, a sense that death should at least be tidy, if not fair. Still, it wasn't linear. Some places ignored the lessons, some forgot them entirely. The next outbreak hit, and suddenly half the city remembered how to shout "quarantine," and the other half started burning rosemary again. But something had changed. Slowly. Persistently. The idea that filth wasn't just ugly, it was dangerous. And with that came something strange. Records. People started writing things down. Ordinances, sanitation plans, lists of fines, medical observations. That maybe it wasn't sin, or astrology, or angering a saint that made you sick. Maybe it was standing too close to the butcher's trench during a heat wave. Even peasants felt the shift. They didn't have ordinances, but they did notice that life was quieter when the well was covered and the pig was penned farther from the kitchen. Children stopped being allowed to sleep directly on the rushes. Beds were lifted. Blankets were beaten. Herbal baths became slightly less rare. Slightly. It wasn't a revolution. It was a correction. 1,000 small habits, born from grief and tiredness, and the shared understanding that something had gone horribly wrong, and no one wanted to do it again. People weren't trying to be cleaner. They were trying to avoid repeating a disaster they still dreamed about. Cleanliness didn't become science overnight, but it became a practice. A thing you did. A thing your neighbour did. A thing your city paid someone to yell at you about, if needed. And for the first time, it felt like maybe you didn't have to live ankle-deep in waste and surrounded by ghosts. Because the plague didn't just take people. It took away excuses. It showed what happened when you left everything to luck and incense. And when it passed, when the cart stopped, and the bells resumed, and the world turned over one more time. People didn't want to go back to pretending the dirt was harmless. So they picked up a broom, hired a raker, dug a deeper ditch, covered the well, washed the linens. Just once a week, maybe. But it was a start. And in a world still teetering on the edge of chaos, that counted as progress. There is a particular kind of silence that follows disaster. Not the kind where everything stops, but the kind where everything resumes, quietly, as if afraid to make too much noise in case the plague decides to come back. The carts are gone. The fever has passed. The shouting has stopped. And somehow, against logic and mud, and every foul smell the 14th century could offer, the world has kept turning. The truth is, the medieval world was never truly clean. It was damp. It was smoky. It reeked of old wool, stale breath, fermented stew, and 100 generations of animals that didn't know how to wipe their feet. The streets were muddy. The floors were straw. The beds were shared. You didn't chase perfection. You chased a small patch of comfort and hoped the rats gave you some space. And still, people survived. Not in gleaming palaces or sterile hospital wings, but in homes where the floor cracked in winter and the roof leaked in 5 different languages. They lived with dirt. They worked with it. They gave birth beside it and buried their dead beneath it. Cleanliness wasn't a state. It was a brief reprieve. A clean shirt, a fresh pot of water, a moment without lice, enough to catch your breath before the next round. They didn't rise every morning because life was glorious. They rose because someone needed feeding, because the fire had gone out, because the cow looked at them funny, because someone had to stir the pot or the bottom would burn again. Hygiene wasn't a goal. It was maintenance. One more sweep, one more rinsed cloth, one more prayer whispered over someone burning with fever. They didn't get medals for it. No sermons were written about the woman who boiled the bandages. No statues were carved for the man who cleaned the muck from the chapel floor. But they were the reason anyone made it to the next feast day. Quiet hands, tired backs, and the relentless belief that maybe tomorrow the stew wouldn't smell quite so weird. The plague didn't change that. It just made it louder. The fear, the smell, the screams. It ripped apart the thin veil between routine and ruin. And when it finally left, when the streets were quiet again and the bells rang for weddings instead of funerals, people didn't emerge better. They emerged different. Older, wiser, clean, not in body, but in purpose. And they went back to work. They swept. They stitched. They scrubbed what they could and ignored what they couldn't. They passed down stories. How to boil herbs. How to avoid bad water. How to tell when someone was too quiet to recover. How to hang rosemary by the door and garlic above the bed. They couldn't explain it, but they knew it helped. And that was enough. The world stayed dirty. Of course it did. Soap was still rare. Water was still cold. Pigs still got inside. But the definition of clean had shifted. It wasn't just about washing away filth. It was about protecting life. About keeping just enough order that the baby didn't catch fever, the food didn't go foul, and the air didn't smell like yesterday's regrets. Clean was a luxury. Survival was the priority. And somehow, through plagues and famine and winters that dragged on like arguments with the sky, people survived. Not with brilliance, but with effort, with routines, with rituals, with habits carved into bone and bread crust. They laughed when they could. They sang when the wind wasn't too loud. They told stories by firelight and taught children how to spit away the evil eye. They didn't wash daily, but they taught respect. For water, for wounds, for the slow art of healing. They didn't chase health. They built it, one handful of clean straw at a time. Even now, centuries later, some of that survives. The way we open windows after illness. The way we light candles for the dead. The way we look at water, clean, flowing, trustworthy, and feel something like awe. These aren't just habits. They're inheritance. Passed down not by kings or scientists, but by people who scrubbed with vinegar and hoped their neighbour didn't sneeze. There was never a golden age of hygiene, just generations of people doing their best with what they had, trying to keep children alive, trying to ease suffering, trying to face a world that never apologised for being cold and complicated and deeply unfair. And still, they rose. They rose with the sun, with the smell of smoke and bread and damp wool, with cracked hands and full hearts and the knowledge that someone had to fetch the water before the well iced over, that someone had to stir the pot, that someone had to tend to the dying, even if it meant coughing by candlelight and whispering prayers with chapped lips. We remember kings. We remember dates. We remember the plague as a number, a graph, a dark chapter in someone else's timeline. But we forget the people who made the bed before the body was cold, who fed the sick when it made them tremble, who washed the cloth, buried the child, and still found the strength to rise again and hold the line against the next wave of illness. They didn't have gloves, or charts, or hand sanitizer. They had hands, and habits, and a kind of hope that had nothing to do with miracles, and everything to do with showing up. So if you remember anything from the medieval struggle with hygiene, not the soap, not the saints, not the questionable bath habits, remember this. The world wasn't clean, but it kept moving, because the people in it did. And maybe that's what clean really meant all along. And so, fellow wanderer, we've reached the end of our not-so-sparkling tale. Hands stained with soot, nostrils full of vinegar, and hearts ever so slightly cleaner than our feet. Medieval hygiene wasn't glamorous. It was gritty, smelly, stubborn survival in a world that never once offered a towel. Thanks for listening. If this strange little trip through soapless centuries gave you peace, perspective, or a reason to appreciate your plumbing, mission accomplished. Drop a comment, maybe where you're listening from, or just say, I survive like a peasant. More quiet chaos and muddy history awaits over on the left. Stay safe, stay kind, and may your water run warm and your bed stay lice-free. See you in the next one.